And one more thing before I actually do this, and you'll see how it relates. I hadn't planned to say this originally, but yesterday I unfortunately had a funeral in Woodbridge, New Jersey, which is about an hour away. So on the way back, I was listening to a podcast, one of my favorite podcasts, which is Freakonomics Radio, and they were doing a series of 3 on AI, artificial intelligence. This was the last one, and they were focusing specifically on ChatGPT and these other things that you can use to help you think and write and all the rest. And one of the women they interviewed had the job known as a prompt engineer. Doesn't mean like to be on time. It was someone who writes prompts like your kids have on tests. Here's the prompt, and here's what you're supposed to then talk about. I had no idea there was such a thing as a prompt engineer. Found out there's lots of discussion about it, and the jobs range from $100,000 to $500,000. So if your kids are in college, it's something to think about. It is basically helping people to write prompts to get more out of the AI. These are jobs now that are appearing in all kinds of businesses that need to be able to get out of ChatGPT and the ones that are coming, the things we want, because they are really pretty stupid. They are these AIs. They just give you what it thinks you want, and what this woman was explaining was that the more you ask the questions, the more you continue to hone in and to change what you say and all the rest of it, it gets better. And so, having actually finished my sermons by yesterday morning, I decided when I came home, I would be interested to see what ChatGPT would do with what I considered my prompt. And so I used some of what she had explained in this podcast, and I said to it, I want you to do this 2,500-word sermon on this topic, which I'm going to explain in a moment, and I want you to do it in the style of Rabbi David Holtz of Temple Beth Abraham in Tarrytown, New York. I figure I've got plenty of sermons on the web. People, it must have crawled across them at some point and seen them, and so this is what it gave me. It's the MS. In his infinite wisdom, Rabbi Holtz always taught us, and I realized it thinks I'm dead. We remember him fondly. So, you'll see in a minute why I included that and why that idea struck me so strongly and why I'm including it now. So, Shana Tova. My daughter Shira is a senior in college. Her major is theater. And last spring she had, in her Shakespeare class, she had to write a play, a one-act play from the perspective of one of Shakespeare's women, of the women in the play, the women who don't get much love from Shakespeare in the play. She chose to do it from the point of view of Ophelia from Hamlet. And I was an English major, but the last time that I read Hamlet was probably when I was an English major, and that was a long time ago. And she has the opportunity actually to present to stage and act in this play herself this coming weekend. And of course, we're going to go see it, and I thought I ought to reread it and have a sense of why she chose, I don't know what she's going to say, but why she chose that particular avenue for Ophelia. So I reread it. I didn't remember it at all. It's a tragedy. In Shakespearean terms, something is a tragedy if a lot of people die, and a comedy is when a few of them live. So Hamlet is a tragedy, and it has as its central motif the question of the value of life, what life really means and how transient it sometimes seems. And we see it perhaps best in Hamlet's famous soliloquy at the beginning of Act 3. You all know it. To be or not to be, that is the question. It's actually a question about whether to commit suicide or not. It is certainly a question of what life really means and whether it's of value. And we also see this idea of the transient nature of life in Act 5 as Hamlet holds the skull of Yorick. Yorick is the court jester that Hamlet had known since he himself was a child in his father's court. Yorick was the court jester. Comes to hold the skull for a bizarre reason because he's in the cemetery and the gravedigger is tossing bones out of a grave, planning to reuse it for the next burial. And it happens to be the grave of Yorick, and he picks up the head, and the gravedigger says, "Don't you know who that is? That's the court jester Yorick." And he holds the skull, and he looks at it, but he speaks to his friend Horatio, who is standing near him, and he says, "Alas, poor Yorick! I knew him, Horatio, a fellow of infinite jest, of most excellent fancy. He hath borne me on his back 1,000 times, and now, how abhorred in my imagination it is! My gorge rims at it. Here hung those lips that I have kissed, I know not how oft. Where be your jibes now, your gambols, your songs, your flashes of merriment that were wont to set the table on a roar?" Hamlet is grieving for Yorick, and more, he is wondering what is left of us, what is left of our actions in life after we die. Are we just a skull? The words are Shakespeare's, but the imagery of using a skull as a reminder of death and all that it stands for goes back at least as far as the Greeks and probably well before that. The image of a skull or an hourglass or a clock or a fading candle, all of them used in this way can be referred to as a memento mori, Latin for remember that you must die. In Europe, it was a common theme in paintings, in carvings on buildings, and in musical elegies. From the late 16th to the 17th centuries, memento mori jewelry was apparently very popular. Mary, Queen of Scots, had a large watch carved in the form of a silver skull, embellished with the lines of the poet Horace. Pale death knocks with the same tempo upon the huts of the poor and the towers of kings. The idea of a memento mori has not disappeared in our time. I've learned that it is growing in popularity, for example, as a subject for tattoos. People will have a tattoo of a skull or of a watch, or just the words memento mori, tattooed somewhere on their body where they can see it and be frequently reminded of our impermanence. And I kid you not, there is an app. There is an app. It is called, wait for it, We Croak. We Croak, which will send you 5 times a day a reminder that you're going to die. And if you respond to the ping, "Oh look, I'm going to die," and you tap on it, it will give you a quote related to how to spend our limited time on earth wisely. The description of the app itself in the iTunes store says that it is based on the Bhutanese folk saying that to be a happy person, one must contemplate death 5 times a day. I have not downloaded this app. As far as we can tell, humans are the only animals who are aware of their own mortality, and therefore we are the only creatures who wonder if we are spending our allotted time wisely. I am quite certain that my 2 house cats are never worried that they are spending too much of the day napping. I, on the other hand, often know that I have other things I ought to be doing, even as I'm heading for the couch for an afternoon siesta. Now, sometimes, of course, a nap is truly the best thing we can do. But sometimes it isn't. Sometimes we're avoiding. There are plenty of moments, or hours, or days in our lives when we know, if we let ourselves think about it, that we are not making the best use of our time. And this is surely why the concept of a memento mori is spread across cultures and across centuries. Now, I have no doubt that it's a good idea to take time periodically to ask ourselves if we're happy with the way we are spending our time, if we could not be doing better. However, to my mind, to accomplish this by carrying around an item that reminds us daily of our own mortality, or tattooing it on our flesh, or being pinged 5 times a day by an app strikes me as more than just a bit self-flagellating, more than just a bit masochistic. Judaism does not ask us to do any of those things, and yet we do, in fact, have plenty of sacred texts which specifically remind us that we are not here forever and we ought to do better. There are verses in Isaiah and Ecclesiastes which say that we are as impermanent as grass or as a fading flower. In Psalm 90, we ask that God teach us to number our days that we might get a heart of wisdom. To realize our days are numbered so that we might spend them better. However, our tradition, I believe fortunately, does not ask us to think about this all the time. In fact, Judaism insists that we focus on our mortality only one day a year. Today is the day. One of the most powerful and overarching roles of Yom Kippur is as an acknowledgement of the inevitability of the end. Some have gone as far as referring to Yom Kippur as a dress rehearsal for death. Think about all of what we say and do on this day. On Yom Kippur, we recite Yizkor, reminding us of those in our lives who have already passed on, and also reminding us that we too will be in that place one day. It is customary to dress all in white, or to wear a white kittel, this overgarment, because that is reminiscent of the white burial shroud. We read the Unetana Tokef, wondering aloud who will live and who will die in the coming year, and then we recite a list of the terrible ways that death might happen. We fast, we abstain from the joys of the flesh, eating and drinking, as a reminder that corpses do not do these things. None of this happens after death. And we pray to be inscribed in the book of life. And just in case we're not, we recite, as we just did, a vidui, a confession of sins, which is reminiscent of the vidui we are supposed to recite on our deathbeds. You may not have known that we have a final confession in Judaism, but we do. And finally, the imagery of the gates closing at Ne'ilah urge us to seize the moment before it's too late. So in short, Yom Kippur is, at least in part, a 25-hour memento mori, a full-day meditation on the fleeting nature of life intended to convince us to stop wasting our time and return to the right path. Now, if this sounds depressing to you, and it certainly does to me, I want us to remember that after dragging us through this metaphorical end-of-life simulation, Yom Kippur ends not with mourning, but rather on a very high note of happiness and anticipation in the joyousness of the coming year. And that, my friends, is why you should never skip Ne'ilah, the closing service. I mean it. After hours of contemplating your mortality, don't cheat yourself out of the happy ending to the day. We finish with a firm resolution to better use the time we are given. We leave here knowing that we can truly do it. Ne'ilah is a powerful moment of catharsis after a day of suffering and introspection. If we are doing it right, Yom Kippur is psychologically a very difficult day. But the point is not to depress us, rather it is to impress upon us that we should not be wasting the limited time we have here on earth. Yom Kippur is a 25-hour-long memento mori, not to create a fear of death, but to renew our appreciation of life, not to beat us into a stupor, but like the shofar, to wake us up, to remind us to cherish what we have while we have it. Yom Kippur asks us to confront our mortality, but only as a way of urging us to fully live our lives. Nearly 200 years ago, Rabbi Simcha Zissel Ziv said the following: remembering death in the proper way can bring a person to the ultimate joy. Joy. And not just any joy, ultimate joy. Think about what he is saying. The contemplation of death can bring one to the ultimate joy. Now, Rabbi Ziv did not fully elaborate on just how that would work, but the Talmudic rabbis did, and they made an amazing correlation. The Kol Nidre prayer that we heard last night refers to this day not as Yom Kippur, but as Yom Kippurim, Day of Atonements in the plural. Yom Kippurim is one of its ancient names. And the rabbis who loved wordplay said, don't read it as Yom Kippurim, but rather as Yom Kippurim, a yom, a day, ki, that is like Purim. Yom Kippurim. Yom Kippur is a day just like Purim. They declared that Yom Kippur, perhaps the most somber day on our calendar, the memento mori of the Jewish people, is just like Purim, perhaps the most joyous day of the year. So how do they come to say that? It's actually very simple. At the end of the Purim story, the book of Esther says that for the Jews of Persia, the day that Haman had chosen for their deaths, quote, had been transformed for them from one of grief and mourning to one of festive joy. Purim is a story of the day that our sorrow is turned to joy. And so it is, say the rabbis, with Yom Kippur. Our day that is filled with angst and confession and fear, that day turns at the very end, at Ne'ilah, to joy. Joy of knowing that we do not have to carry our sins into the new year. Joy at the gift of our lives, which is ours to do with as we will. And joy at the renewed understanding we have of the importance of making our time count. After that final Tekiyah Gedolah, we walk out of temple hungry, not just for the break fast, but for all of the myriad opportunities that a new year brings. This is the way in which the contemplation of death can bring one to the ultimate joy. It is Yom Kippur. And then, as if to emphasize the point, our calendar has us pivot only 4 days later to the festival of Sukkot, the holiday we refer to as Zman Simchatenu, the season of our simcha, the season of our rejoicing. And the week of Sukkot ends at Simchat Torah, the simcha, the joyous moment when we celebrate completing and restarting the cycle of reading the Torah. It is a brilliant juxtaposition. On Yom Kippur, we are asked to acknowledge our mortality, and we are asked to use it to motivate us to recalibrate our moral compass, to prioritize our time, to mend relationships, and to seek and offer forgiveness. And on Sukkot, we are asked to put into practice what we have just promised. We are asked to be fully present in the moment, to notice the miracles which daily surround us, and not just to notice them, but to celebrate them, to celebrate the daily joys of food and shelter represented by the Sukkah, the daily joys of family and community whom we invite to join us. In this calendrical juxtaposition of Yom Kippur and Sukkot, we can clearly see our tradition's insistence that while we must acknowledge the things we have done wrong, the moments we have misused, the sorrow, the fear, we must acknowledge all of it, but it is not where we should spend most of our time. Yom Kippur lasts a day, Sukkot lasts 7 days. We have a day of atonement, but a week of celebration. It's a pretty good ratio. This tells us where our faith suggests we focus our attention and our lives. The words that we chose to inscribe over this ark when we redid it several years ago, the words at the beginning read, Ivdu et Hashem b'simcha, come before God with joy. It doesn't mean that we cannot come before God when we're unhappy. Sometimes that is when we need God most. These words on our ark are aspirational. They express Judaism's hope that there is much more celebration than there is sadness in our lives. And they tell us something else. They tell us we should not only come to God when we need something, only when things are difficult. We should also come to God in joy, to give thanks for the many, many things that are so wonderful in our lives. Our faith acknowledges and embraces the complexities of life. It tells us that we can find meaning, we can even find holiness in the dance between sorrow and joy. It insists that we take the time to ask ourselves how we are spending our time, and then it insists that we live our lives fully, intentionally, and as much as we are able, with great joy. So as we move toward the end of these days of awe, may we be able to see the difficult lessons of Yom Kippur not as a depressing reminder of how we have misused our time this past year, but rather may we see them as a catalyst, a spur, driving us to cherish and to celebrate the time that we still have. Amen. Gemar Chatima Tova.